Nothing needs to be earned in this moment. If you are hearing this, know that your arrival here is not an accident. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. That is the pivot. That is the quiet switch that changes everything inside first, and then the world around you follows. You did not come to learn another tactic. You came to stop timing your worth, to release the habit of counting proof before you allow yourself peace. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. When I say measuring, I mean the tiny, relentless accounting you perform against your life. Checks for likes, ticks on a to-do list, hours logged, numbers watched, receipts kept as evidence of worth. Measuring looks like checking your bank balance and then checking your worth against the digits. Measuring looks like timing your success as if it were a race with a finish line you can sprint to. Measuring makes your nervous system small and tight. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Notice how measuring feels in your body. You can feel it now if you let yourself. Maybe it is a subtle tightness behind the sternum, a small thickening in the throat when your phone buzzes. Maybe it is the shallow breath, the rapid thinking that loops solutions and contingencies. That is the physiology of measurement. Contracted, alert, scanning for proof. Abundance begins when you stop measuring, and the first sign of the shift is a loosening of that shape. Breath deepening, a small softening around the chest, an inner permission to exhale. When you stop measuring, the body begins to remember how to be safe. There is no moral judgment here. Measuring was adaptive. It helped you navigate scarcity, survive hard seasons, and build skills for a world that often rewards visible toil. But measuring has become a habit you now outgrow. Abundance begins when you stop measuring because the habit that once protected you now limits the range of what you can receive. You move from hustling for proof to allowing what shows up to be meaningful in itself. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Imagine a field of water. Measurement is like dropping stones into that field constantly, watching the ripples, timing the distance between waves. Every stone provokes a reaction, but the constant tossing keeps the surface restless. When you stop throwing stones, the surface calms. The field begins to reflect more clearly. This is not magical language about physics. It is a coaching image. Your inner field becomes quieter, and that quietness changes how opportunities land. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. You may be skeptical, you should be. Skepticism keeps balance. But listen for the small evidence. There are practical signs to watch for that accompany this release. First, synchronicities. Small, meaningful coincidences that feel like gentle confirmations rather than loud proclamations. A name drops into your conversation just as you were thinking of a person who can help. A book you need falls into your hands without searching for it. These are not proof of a promise. They are patterns that often emerge when your internal frequency steadies. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Second, ideas arrive with less effort. Suddenly you notice clear solutions or creative bursts that were previously strangled by anxiety and comparison. The difference is subtle. Before, ideas came with a caveat and a checklist. Now they arrive with a quiet clarity. When you stop measuring, the mind finds space to create, and those creations ripple outward. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Third, people respond differently, not because you have changed your pitch or perfected a presentation, but because you are no longer moving from a place of need. Your calm invites different reflections from others. Invitations shift tone. Conversations open doors instead of seeking validation. You may notice that old contacts reappear, not because something miraculous happened to them, but because your steadiness changes the way you show up in the field. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Fourth, resources unfreeze, sometimes in ways that feel quietly practical. A client follows up without you chasing. A small payment arrives when you least expected it. A door that felt permanently shut nudges open. These are not guarantees or formulas. They are observed patterns when nervous system safety replaces frantic claiming. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. This shift starts internally with nervous system regulation. You do not need to master a complicated protocol. You need small practices that help your body rewire from survival to receptivity. Simple cues, slow breath, softening in the belly, letting the shoulders release, are the first language of this transformation. When you stop measuring, you make space for your nervous system to know you are safe enough to receive. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. There is a tension many of us inherit from hustle culture, the belief that activity equals value. We learn to log hours as if our clocking in were proof that we deserve receiving. But worth is not a number on a spreadsheet. When you stop measuring, you step into an identity that is not a ledger. You carry the same abilities, the same integrity, but you shift the internal standard from output to being. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. So how do you practice this in daily life without abandoning responsibility? First, choose rest as a strategy, not as surrender. Rest is not a reward. It is a baseline that keeps your nervous system regulated. Rest looks like purposeful pauses between tasks, sleep that is protected, and micro breaks that allow your breath to slow. When you stop measuring and make rest non-negotiable, you are building capacity to hold more without reactivity. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Second, move when movement is clear. Movement is not the opposite of rest. Movement is aligned action. Learn to differentiate between movement driven by scarcity, anxiety-fueled doing, and movement that feels clean, purposeful, and inspired. When you stop measuring, your actions become more precise and less frantic. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Third, practice gratitude as a baseline frequency rather than as a manipulative technique. Gratitude is not a checklist of things you must recite to get something. Gratitude is the gentle recognition of what already exists inside and around you, which anchors you in the present. When you stop measuring, gratitude ceases to be a tactic and becomes the atmosphere you inhabit. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Fourth, receive without guilt. There is a cultural thread that ties receiving to deservingness, and it breeds a subtle tension. You accept, then immediately discount it. That pattern dampens the field. Receiving without guilt is a discipline. It looks like saying thank you and meaning it, allowing help, accepting compliments, and letting resources pass into your life without over-explaining. When you stop measuring, you stop triangulating your worth through constant proving, and you can receive with dignity. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Fifth, steward what arrives. Receiving is not passive surrender. It invites wise tending. Stewardship is the responsible counterpart to allowance, budgeting with intention, investing care into relationships that return value, setting boundaries around what you will allow into your field. When you stop measuring, stewardship becomes natural because you are no longer in frantic accumulation. You are organizing gifts into use. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. You will want examples. Here are small hypothetical scenes that show the taste of this shift without promising outcomes. Imagine a designer who stops refreshing analytics every hour and instead takes a walk, allowing ideas to clarify. A week later, a referral arrives that leads to a project she enjoys. Imagine an entrepreneur who stops timing the next funding round with a calendar and instead focuses on building a small, steady product that serves users and notices a pattern of requests from a market she had not considered. Imagine a parent who stops equating productivity with love and begins to model presence for their child. The family rhythm calms, and new support arrives organically. These are not scripts for success. They are glimpses of how life reorganizes when measuring subsides. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. There will be friction. Old habits resurge. The mind will ask for proof, and your body may tighten at the slightest statistical variance. Expect moments when you slip back into measurement. When that happens, name it without shame. Say to yourself, "Oh, there it is," checking again. Then breathe, soften, and return. The practice is a gentle reorientation, not a one-time flip. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Pay attention to timing and synchronicity without building calendars around them. You may notice patterns in the coming weeks or months. That timing is not a mandate, it is an observation. Sometimes shifts are immediate in felt experience, an inner expansion, a lighter chest. Sometimes external signs accumulate slowly, patterns of alignment that feel inevitable in hindsight. Either way, measurement collapses those timelines into anxiety. When you stop measuring, you allow timing to be an ally rather than an enemy. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Let me describe 3 somatic signals you can watch for. First, a deeper in-breath and a fuller out-breath. Not a dramatic change, but a small increase in ease with each cycle. Second, a sensation of wideness or space behind the sternum, as if your chest is no longer braced for impact. Third, a reduction in reactivity. When someone challenges you, you can respond rather than reflexively shield. These are bodily evidence of nervous system regulation. When you stop measuring, your body remembers how to be ready without being alarmed. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. There are mental signs too. You may find yourself thinking less about timelines and more about meaning. You may notice fewer scenarios in your head about what must happen first, and more curiosity about what feels true now. You will trade a tightly held checklist for a softer compass. When you stop measuring, your attention shifts from scarcity proof to presence proof. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. I want to be specific about what to avoid. Do not use this as permission to ignore wise financial planning or long-term responsibility. Stopping measurement is not an excuse to be reckless. It is a shift from frantic evidence chasing to embodied stewardship. Keep your practical systems, budgets, mentors, advisors, counsel. Allow these tools to be just that, tools, rather than your identity. When you stop measuring, you are free to use discipline without desperation. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. You may worry that stopping measurement equals complacency. That is not the case. The discipline here is refined. You remain strategic while releasing the inner tallying that saps clarity. Think of it as trading noise for fidelity. When the mind is not occupied with constant accounting, it accesses higher quality choices. When you stop measuring, your actions are less reactive and more aligned. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Sometimes abundance looks small at first. A quiet conversation with a neighbor that leads to a helpful introduction. A serendipitous course you enroll in that later feels pivotal. A small increase in monthly revenue that steadies your confidence. These are not the hype of overnight fortune. They are the scaffolding of real, sustainable expansion. When you stop measuring, you make room for these incremental, meaningful shifts. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Another marker. Your relationship with time softens. You stop forcing outcomes on a timeline that doesn't belong to you. You stop equating motion with progress. Instead, you learn to read your impulses. When your body urges movement, move. When it calls for rest, rest. That is the rhythm of alignment. When you stop measuring, time becomes a companion, not a judge. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Gratitude needs a special note. This practice is not about forcing positivity over real pain. It is a recognition that threads of goodness exist even in hardship, and naming them steadies the nervous system. Gratitude shifts your baseline frequency by expanding what you notice. When you stop measuring, gratitude becomes a lived orientation rather than a performance. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. You may find resistance in the form of a voice insisting on more evidence. That voice is not the enemy. It is the old protector trying to earn safety. Speak to it kindly. Explain that you are not abandoning care, only reconfiguring the approach. Tell it, I will still plan. I will still tend. I will stop throwing stones into the pond. When that inner guardian is acknowledged, it often relaxes. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Practice small experiments. Try a week where you limit one measuring behavior. No analytics checks for a project. No hourly time tracking for certain creative periods. No tallying likes as proof. And observe what shifts. Keep a simple journal of sensations. What changed in your breath? What conversations arrived? What ideas surfaced? Treat this like an inquiry rather than a test you must pass. When you stop measuring experimentally, you gather data that is humane and informative. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. There is an ethical dimension to abundance that I want you to hold. True abundance tends toward generosity. When you stop measuring your worth against external proof, you can show up with more capacity to share. Generosity becomes a natural expression, not a display. Stewardship then extends outward. Resources, time, attention. Abundance that tightens the heart is not aligned. Abundance that opens hands and minds is the kind that lasts. When you stop measuring, generosity often follows. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Let me offer a small, practical routine to anchor this shift. Each morning, take 3 intentional breaths, noticing the space each exhale creates. Say quietly, "Today I stop measuring as the primary metric of my worth." Keep this short and firm. Through the day, when you catch yourself checking for proof, pause, breathe, and return to the work with curiosity. At night, list 3 small things that felt nourishing. No need to quantify their worth. Over weeks, this gives your nervous system a pattern to learn from. When you stop measuring in these small ways, you condition both body and attention toward receiving. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. There is a subtle test that reveals progress, peace with uncertainty. Not resignation, but a calm that allows not knowing to sit without immediate panic. When you stop measuring, uncertainty loses much of its terror because you no longer tie your identity to immediate evidence. That calm does not mean everything will be comfortable, but it does mean you can act from steadiness. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Hold this as a simple truth. Abundance is not always a spike. It is often a leveling, an accessible baseline of safety, creative access, and resource flow that does not require constant proof. When you stop measuring, you are inviting the universe to meet you where you stand instead of chasing it down the street with a clipboard. This is not an invitation to abandon care. It is an invitation to release the frantic ledger that steals peace. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. You will be tempted to test the limits of this idea with performance checks. Ask instead, does this feel like more life or less life? Does it expand my ability to be present, to give, to hold my commitments? These qualitative questions steer you away from the shriveled calculus of measurement and into a larger metric, capacity. If capacity increases, even slowly, you are on the path. When you stop measuring by external ticks, you begin to measure by capacity to receive and steward. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Now let me be clear about language around miracles and money. Some people will call the signs miraculous. Some will call them coincidences. I prefer the middle ground. They are patterns that emerge when attention and nervous system safety align. They are not guarantees, and they are not grounds for rash financial decisions. Do the work in your life with good counsel, wise plans, and integrity. When you pair grounded action with internal receptivity, you increase the possibility of sustainable abundance. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. As you move forward, cultivate a gentle skepticism toward your own impatience. When you feel frantic, ask, "Am I measuring again?" Then breathe and recalibrate. This practice is not one that will make you flawless. It will make you steadier. The steadiness invites different materials into your life. Friendships that last, projects that nourish, finances that support, not drain. When you stop measuring, you begin to inhabit a new baseline where abundance becomes less dramatic and more ordinary. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Let the climax of this thought land. Abundance becomes the default when you stop measuring it into existence. Not because the universe owes you something, but because you have stopped contracting to prove you deserve it. That contraction is the very signal that keeps abundance distant. Release it, and you open a space that can hold more. Permanence replaces peaks. Calm replaces chase. Abundance begins when you stop measuring. Before I close, take one small action now. Place your hand over your heart. Inhale slowly for 4 counts, and exhale for 6. Notice any softening. Hold the intention. I will look for signs, not proof. I will rest without guilt. I will receive with dignity. If this message lands with you, and you want more short practices for staying aligned, tap like and subscribe. That helps us keep offering the steady reminders that support your shift. Walk away with this single affirmation. I stop measuring and allow my life to align. Say it quietly to yourself when measurement urges return. Practice it as the truth you are willing to live into, not as a promise that replaces prudence. If you want a short grounding audio that supports this state, the breathing, the somatic reset, and a 5-minute journal prompt, there is a link where you can download it. Use it gently. Use it often. Keep your planning wise, your heart open, and your body calm. Remember always, abundance begins when you stop measuring. Keep that phrase near your breath. Let it be the quiet compass that returns you to steadiness when the mind reaches for proof. Watch for the small signs, synchronicities, ideas arriving, people responding, resources unfreezing, and steward them with care. Rest. Move cleanly. Receive without guilt. Be generous. These are the practices of a life that holds more without needing to count every grain that falls. Abundance begins when you stop measuring.